What is going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's talk about the best decks in Marvel Snap. You know him, you hate him. It's Loki at the top spot. Now, there is a little bit of a difference between every other week when I've said Loki is the best deck and this week when I'm saying Loki is the best deck, which is to say, I do think it's the best deck, but I do think there are currently compelling reasons to play other lists in a similar shell. What I mean by this is Bounce with Darkhawk, generally the same or similar core of 4/1 drops, a Falcon, Werewolf by Night, etc., is a quite powerful option for you to choose. There's also the Bounce with Gladiator and Dr. Octopus. I fundamentally view these as slight downgrades from Loki, though. And here's why. When it comes to Loki, the Werewolf by Night package is entered into a merger of equals. It is added into a deck that is already doing something incredibly strong and incredibly powerful that it already has synergy with. For example, the Collector used to be a card that would be run in Bounce decks, and this deck does get to use it as a Bounce payoff with Falcon. However, it's also a Loki payoff. Cards like Maria Hill and Snowguard are excellent with Loki and also go back to your hand with Falcon. This overlap between two powerful strategies is, to me, what puts this deck at the top of the metagame right now. It is a true merger of equals rather than in, say, the Bounce Darkhawk lists. The Darkhawk is definitely playing second fiddle to the Werewolf. In this case, there are two tech slots that you can use to your heart's content in this build. Those slots in this deck are currently being used by Cosmo and Shang-Chi. I want to draw particular attention to Shang-Chi because this deck I think I've lost more games on by incorrectly identifying whether I wanted to be a Shang-Chi deck or a Loki deck. And I think this, to me, is the major draw of the other builds using the Bounce Wolf core. That is, they are never running the risk of getting rid of their Shang-Chi. When you draw your Shang-Chi and it's turn 5, and you have to choose between having Shang-Chi on turn 6 and playing Loki on turn 5, that's a real legitimate choice to make. Shang-Chi is that good right now. And I think I've lost more games making the incorrect version of that choice, whether that be I should have Loki'd or I should have not Loki'd, than to anything else in this entire deck. There is a very high skill cap on this, not just the normal Loki skill cap of you have to know what your opponent is playing, but that in addition to judging what of your plans, Shang-Chi or Loki, is better into their expected turn 6. This list is the easiest of the Bounce Wolf shells to play, and I think the sort of prototypical one. It's a very easy thing to look at and say, okay, I get what this deck is doing, and I get how I can move cards in and out of it. Now, the basic thing is still the same. I will draw attention to one little difference, though. This deck plays 5/1 cost cards, and one of them is Bast, who I think there is legitimately room to mess around with here. We've seen Bounce-style decks succeed with just 4. If you want to add, say, a Shang-Chi in there, I think that might not be a terrible idea. I'm definitely interested in experimenting with that. As is, this deck only gets one of the slots. It has only Shadow King as its major tech option, and it relies mostly on Disruption as a way of making sure that, something like Shang-Chi isn't going to be incredibly relevant. Because when your opponent is losing a draw to a Black Widow, and then losing a draw to a bounced Black Widow, and then maybe losing a draw to a Korgrok, it's a lot less worrisome what they're doing, and you are a lot more able to just beat them with the cards that you're actually playing. That's the fundamental ethos of this deck. It doesn't want to worry too much about what your opponent is doing because it's more focused on stopping them from doing it, whatever it is. It's that old saying about the pig. You can't argue with the pig. You can't mud wrestle with the pig. If you do, they'll drag you down to your level and beat you with experience. Did I butcher that aphorism? Absolutely, but I'm pretty sure you get the point. Destroy is the roll downhill deck in Marvel Snap, a deck that is so powerful when it works and so weak when it gets disrupted that it often retreats on sight of a, priority armor on the Deadpool X-23 lane. That's pretty bad. Now, that said, when it rolls downhill, it is borderline unstoppable. This deck is unbelievable when it pulls off the stuff that it wants to pull off. In most Destroy decks, there are 2 flex spots. They are currently in this list being used for Deathlock and Taskmaster. Taskmaster has the ability of removing your reliance of blowing up X-23 on the second to final turn of the game. Normally, without Taskmaster in the deck, you have to do this in order to play something like Deadpool plus Null. Now you have the option to do it, but you can also play a Deadpool and a Taskmaster, meaning you can be a little more free with your destruction. That said, you do need to keep in mind that there is a finite amount of destruction effects in your deck. You have Killmonger, you have Carnage, you have Venom, and you have Deathlock. Adding Deathlock in definitely helps, but you still need to understand when you need to be using these cards. If you're planning on playing Null Deadpool, don't blow up stuff willy-nilly. Now, that said, the addition of Nico really helps here. Nico for draw 2 is extremely powerful in this list. Nico to copy a Venom or a Carnage that has already gotten some stats on it is also extremely powerful. This deck rolls downhill very well, and Nico Minoru drawing 2 cards is one of your best early game plays because one of the things that makes this deck roll downhill is having the correct cards in hand, and the more cards you draw, especially early, the more likely you are to do something incredibly stupid with them. In my recent video on this deck, I called it the most underrated deck in Marvel Snap. I got a lot of hate about that. People were like, what do you mean Shuri's underrated? We don't not play it because we don't think it's good. We don't play it because we think it's boring. And I will fully admit that a lot of people think this deck is boring. That said, I think if you want a simple and easy deck to play, and you are a person who does not have the interest in acquiring a bunch of pay-to-win cards, this is the deck for you. Now, I know people are going to get on me because I said pay-to-win, and I have Echo in here. You got me. You don't need Echo to play this deck. Echo is just a card that I like in there. There are plenty of options for what you can play in that slot instead. Feel free to try things like Enchantress or Nebula. Those are options that make a lot of sense to me. In addition, I think people underestimate just how good playing Sauron is in here. For this reason, we are running America Chavez in the top end slot, but that's not a thing you absolutely have to do. Feel free to experiment with running around cards like Dr. Doom or Alioth. These are also cards that can really fill roles in this deck that are often unfilled. Alioth can slam the doors on games that people just simply aren't expecting, and Dr. Doom allows you a way to spread power across multiple lanes even when you don't have a Sauron Ebony Maw. These are both viable options. This is the list that I have, but I would truly regard Echo and Chavez as flex slots as it currently stands. I didn't really expect to ever have to put a Cerebro deck on here in earnest, and I've been wrong about that multiple times already. I've had Cerebro 3 on here, and now currently Cerebro 5 is on here. While I don't consider this a top tier option, I do consider it a deck that is significantly better than it should be. One change that I've made from the typical list is that I'm running Stegron instead of Enchantress. This is a purposeful nod to the Loki matchup. The Loki matchup is very bad if they can get a 3-cost Enchantress and blow up everything you're planning on doing. Not necessarily Cerebro, but definitely Miss Marvel. That said, this deck is a deck that exposes Cerebro pretty early. Unless you're playing an early Dr. Doom, Cerebro is often coming down around turn 5. And that means that you are going to be in a situation where turning off the Cerebro can be very bad for you. In addition, this is very much not a Cerebro deck, in the sense that it does not need Cerebro to function, and it does not want to run Mystique. This is a deck that is full of generally good cards, that is going to play a safe mid-range game, backed up by the power of Dr. Doom and Miss Marvel, and Cerebro is a good power multiplier. You can often play it as something like, a 312 or whatever. That's a good card, but it's not something that you want to be overly invested in. It's not your entire game plan. You play a bunch of good cards. That's your game plan. One of the most underrated aspects of this deck is the disruptive potential that it has, especially against decks that like to play a lot of cards early, like Loki. Granted, they can Falcon them back, and that kind of sucks, but filling up a lane with Polaris and Spider-Man triggers, getting a free Miles Morales out there, that's really not bad. I've included this list, which I recently did a video on. Multiple people are disputing who it actually came from, Dara or TLSG, so what I'm going to say is they're both awesome, and I had both on my podcast, and I'm very grateful for my friendship with both of them. So please check both of them out. I really have no knowledge of which one of them came up with the deck first. I really do not know. All I can tell you is, yeah, absolutely. They're both super cool. I like them both. And by the way, if I catch any of you going to other people's comments and telling people, you have to credit KMBest for this, please don't do that. I just want to say that right now. Not that I feel a certain type of way about people doing that in my comments, but please don't do that to others. With that said, let's move on to the deck. This is a bounce deck that is built around the same shell as the Bounce Darkhawk list, but instead of relying on the Darkhawk stuff, it goes a little bit more all in on disrupting your opponent. The main reason this deck kind of works right now is because Dr. Octopus is quite good against a lot of the metagame right now. A lot of decks are relying on playing cards in a specific order, or more accurately, specific cards on the final few turns of the game. Pulling a bunch of stuff out of a Loki deck can be really good, Pulling a bunch of stuff out of a destroy deck, a little more coin flippy. Pulling a bunch of stuff out of a bounce deck is phenomenal. Of course, there is the risk that your opponent Loki's you on turn 4, and that is the strategy that I have used with Loki when playing against Dara on ladder. I just play their Darkhawk, and it's a lot better for me than it is for them. I do think the addition of the Hood over the Yondu and Ghost Spider that I believe TLSG and Dara were running makes the Loki matchup a little bit better. That's a card that they really can't get a lot of value out of, but you hopefully will get a ton out of. Again, though, it is a little bit hampered by the potential for Loki on 4. Good Loki players, and this is a part that Loki players should be taking note of, will approach the matchups against decks like this, and this includes the Darkhawk list, by trying to set up a situation where the Loki giving them a Falcon and a Beast is actually very good. So what they'll do is they'll try to set up a situation where they have a good Beast lane, or if they get a Falcon, they can put a bunch of 1-drops in hand and do your game plan to you. That's how they have to approach this matchup. Once that is more widely disseminated, and I know I'm doing myself a disservice by putting it in this video, but that's how you do it, this matchup might get a lot worse. Still, I really do think this is a solid deck. A note on Gladiator, you don't need him to play this deck. He's cool, but you could very easily just play Polaris instead, and I would absolutely not get mad at you, and it might actually be better. If you want to play traditional Darkhawk, I think this is the shell that I prefer. It was created by Slicenberger, aka Stefan on ladder, and I use created very loosely here because it's Darkhawk. We've kind of all played the same 12 cards in it at some point, right? Like, that's just how it works. One of the real reasons that you'd want to play this, and I consider this kind of the only real reason that you'd want to play this over any of the other werewolf shells, because the first question I have when I look at this list is, why would I play this over any of the other werewolf shells when they're so much better at doing the werewolf thing? And the answer is basically Killmonger. The other werewolf shells, Falcon, Beast, 1-drops, can't really afford to run him. If you want to play a deck with Killmonger, that also gets to abuse Werewolf by Night. This is kind of where you have to end up going. Or perhaps maybe a Surfer type deal like we saw a couple tier lists ago. I don't think that's necessarily out of the... I don't think that's necessarily a terrible option either. You can do it, but I think this is probably a better one. We've got a classic Bigbaby Cook here, and this is a destroy kind of, Darkhawk kind of Mr. Negative deck that is mostly built to be a deck that is going to win a lot of cubes, but not necessarily have a very high win rate. When I looked at Bigbaby's stats with it, he had a positive win rate with it, which is really kind of berserk, but his cubes were way beyond what you would expect. So if you want to play this deck, you need to understand when to snap and when not to snap. So the good news is I'm going to have Bigbaby on. We're going to do a deeper dive into this deck so you can understand what the actual way to play this deck is. But the basic thing you have to understand about it is you need to rely on the fact that your opponents are not going to have a good idea of what you're doing. That means you have things like Zola and Null. They don't know that. You have things like Shang-Chi. They don't know that. You have this Darkhawk stuff. They don't know that. This is not what people expect to see out of a Mr. Negative deck. And that is the thing that you need to leverage in order to win. If you have things like Zabu, Negative, Jane, you kind of are priced into snapping unless your entire hand is cards you would otherwise draw off of Jane. And sometimes there's going to be games where you snap those hands and then you draw everything you would have drawn off of Jane before the Mr. Negative goes off, and you're like, oh, well, I guess I die. That happens. It sucks. You're going to have to live with it. This deck is for the gamblers. Finally, Hela does deserve a bit of shine here. I believe this is Husky Puppy's list. He's been climbing inside the top 25 with it, which is more than I think anyone could reasonably expect from Hela. I might have him on as well to do a deeper dive into how this list actually works. One of the things people have expressed to me is, hey, KM, I know you do a lot of meta stuff. Maybe you should highlight some of these off-meta deck builders, and, you know, stay tuned. Maybe we will. As far as this deck goes, it is a deck that deck name is straight from the guy who plays it. It is called Hate Yourself Hela. You will play it, you will hate yourself. It is incredibly depressing to reduce the entire game of Marvel Snap to spinning a roulette wheel, but that is what you do, and this deck will help get that job done. If you want to play a deck that truly rewards you for being a gambler, these last two decks are the way to do it, and they've actually had success in High Infinite. This is not just like fringe garbage, it's stuff that actually works. You just require a very, very, very specific mindset in order to succeed with it. All right, y'all. That's going to be it from me on this one. Thank you so much for making it this far. And if you heard a little bit of tapping or sounds during this, I'm sorry. I just put a pop filter on my mic, and I'm a hand talker, so I've been hitting the bottom of it like one time per segment each time. I'm afraid that that made it through to the video, but if it did, I'm sorry. Deal. I'll do my best to fix it in post. Hopefully you hear nothing. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to, but I will try. Thank you so much for making it this far. I have been KMBest. Remember to like and subscribe. All those things make me super happy. I will see you in the next one. Have a good one.